Rotarians, Rotaractors, and people of action. My name is Thomas Paul, and welcome to another episode of Rotary Project Manager, a podcast about project management for Rotary clubs and volunteer organizations. Understanding and working with stakeholders effectively is critical to a successful project. It could mean the difference between success and failure. Effective stakeholder engagement can make a project more effective, take less time, and use fewer resources. As Rotarians and other volunteers with limited resources, this is all good news. All in all, working well with our project stakeholders will make us more impactful. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about stakeholders, what a stakeholder is, how to identify a stakeholder, and how to analyze stakeholders on our project. In our last episode called Strong Foundations for Your Project, we talked about 3 important assets to supercharge your project. They are the project charter, the team charter, and the scope statement. If you haven't listened to that episode, I encourage you to check it out now. Don't forget to let us know how we're doing and ideas for future episodes. You can visit us at rotarypm.ca for all the details. Our guest today is fellow Rotarian Chris Hornberger. Chris is an experienced business leader, certified management consultant, and certified executive coach. She is a founding partner of Halifax Global Inc., a firm specializing in providing executive services to its clients, including strategic planning and facilitation, coaching, and strategic counsel. Prior to consulting, Chris worked in the public and private sector in Canada and the United States as a senior leader in workers' compensation, health insurance, and health IT. Chris joined Rotary in 2016 and has been very active within our club, our district, and our zone. Thanks, Chris, for joining us to speak about stakeholders. But before we begin, tell us about your Rotary story.
I guess I've always known about Rotary, like way back when I was 14. I was a banquet waitress in Kitchener, Ontario, which is where I'm from. And we, in the day, the service clubs were, they were all men. And it was very prestigious to be part of a service club, and they would meet for lunch or dinner or whatever it was. And I was a banquet waitress at these events. So I knew about Rotary. Yeah. So that was my first knowledge of Rotary. What got me into it was that I was having lunch with Louisa Horn, and she was the membership chair, I believe, at the time. And what intrigued me was the involvement, both the community involvement and the international involvement. And so I liked the idea of being able to work on 2 levels. And I was looking for some other kind of volunteer engagement than what I've been engaged with. So I decided to give it a try.
What do you think is most appealing to you at Rotary?
What I really value is having a platform to make a much greater impact in some of the things that I'm interested in. So you're aware of the Aninga project. And I've been a champion of that project for a long time, and the club has supported it for a long time. I'm able to, by being the champion for that project, I'm able to bring the support of a club to Aninga, which I wouldn't otherwise do. And so, it has so much more impact. And I value being involved in projects that have an impact.
The Aninga project that you mentioned is a fantastic initiative to support young women in East Africa, something that you brought to our club and we ran with. We'll share the link in our show notes if folks want to learn more about the Aninga project. So getting back to stakeholders, why don't we start with the first question? From the Rotary perspective, tell us, Chris, what is a stakeholder?
Well, a stakeholder is someone, and that could be an individual or a group of some kind who has some kind of vested interest or stake in what the club does or what an organization does in a broader sense. So what they do, what their activities are, how decisions are made. So when we talk about examples of stakeholders, It's good to think about them from an internal perspective and an external perspective. And so from a club's perspective, a Rotary club's perspective, your internal stakeholders would be your members, your board of directors who are also members, but they wear a particular hat. The members are also volunteers, but again, the volunteers and involved, particularly their involvement in different projects, needs to be considered from a different perspective than just a member. Similarly, you would have committees or teams. And then you have external stakeholders. So if we were to take, for example, RibFest, we have volunteers, we've got sponsors, we've got vendors, we've got the municipality, Alderney Landing or the venue where we hold the event. We have community partners, and we have the community generally. And there may be others, but that's a list of stakeholders who have an interest in RibFest.
So the project team has gone through the process of listing their stakeholders, but why do we do this? Like, why is this important for a project?
We can't do things on our own. It takes a village. Every project takes a village. And to ensure that we're engaging our stakeholders, we're managing their expectations, we're understanding what they need from the club in order to stay engaged, and similarly, what we need from them to engage them. So there's kind of a quid pro quo relationship between a stakeholder and the club. And each party needs something from the other. About RibFest, for example, the reason people might want to become involved with RibFest is because it gives them a leadership opportunity. It gives them an opportunity to develop their project management skills. So there's some professional development there. It builds friendships. It develops their network, appeals to their sense of community and doing good in the community. So those are the kinds of things that a stakeholder may want, particularly when you're thinking about a volunteer. And similarly, what does RibFest need from the stakeholder? Well, they need to know that the stakeholder, the volunteer in this case, is going to commit the time, the skills, the expertise, the relationships, that other resources that they may bring to the table. When you have an understanding of what that relationship is between the stakeholder and the club or the project, then you are able to figure out how you meet those expectations from a club perspective. And similarly, it allows you to be clear from the very beginning with your stakeholders that this is what we need from you. And this is what we're going to give you in return. So it's a communication tool as well.
How would you suggest project teams start identifying stakeholders?
Well, if they've never done it before, I mean, the first step is always to step back and think about who's involved with your project. Who do you need involved with this project? And so that can be a brainstorming exercise, and the project team should be able to do that. We do that at the beginning of a project with our clients. But one of the things we do is develop something called a stakeholder wheel, which is just basically a way to identify who the stakeholders are. It's and we're talking about stakeholder groups here, not so much individuals. Although eventually you do need to get down to individuals, because you're going to need to communicate with them in some way, shape, or form, or engage with them in some way.
Yeah, I agree. A stakeholder wheel is a great way to help start the conversation about who a project stakeholders may be. We've included an example stakeholder wheel in our show notes. Listeners can find all our show notes and other resources at rotarypm.ca. I think it's important to remember that everything we do on a project, including when we work through listing stakeholders, it is to add value. In Rotary, we call this impact. So while an extensive stakeholder list may add some value or impact, there is a point where the effort putting into this project or into this effort is not going to match the value that's coming out.
You can also get way too broad. If it's way too broad, it makes it much more difficult to communicate, and it almost becomes, I want to say, a useless exercise. I don't know that it would be useless. That's the wrong word, but it becomes a much more difficult exercise when you get into really assessing what's the importance of these stakeholders, and how do we need to interact and engage with them.
So we have a list of stakeholders. We now need to be able to understand our stakeholders and manage that information with stakeholder analysis. So, what is stakeholder analysis?
Well, the stakeholder analysis is a process of identifying, categorizing, prioritizing your stakeholders based on what their interest and what their influence might be in the project. So that helps you then to understand what their needs are, their concerns, and their expectations. And it then allows you to develop a plan to engage with them and to monitor that engagement.
So, I guess the information you gather from your analysis leads to how you're going to work with the different stakeholders. A stakeholder with high level of influence will need to be handled differently than a stakeholder with a lower level of influence.
So depending on their interest and their influence, some are going to need a lot more communication and engagement than others. For example, volunteer recruitment and engagement. There's a lot of communication and a lot of work that goes around recruiting and engaging volunteers for any project. There's a different type of communication, different channels of communication, different times of communication, different people you're communicating with. So that analysis just helps you understand all of those things so that you're not miscommunicating or missing the opportunity to communicate and engage altogether. That's why an analysis of stakeholders and really understanding who they are and their importance to the project is important.
So, we know stakeholder analysis is really important, but can you tell us about a tool that you use commonly to help analyze stakeholders?
Well, there's a simple tool that most projects use that has four quadrants. Each quadrant has some different words in it. So the four quadrants are you need to just keep these stakeholders satisfied. So that requires a different type of engagement, or you need to really manage these stakeholders closely, or you need to monitor them, or you just need to keep them informed. And then on a different axis, on the two different axes, you have influence and interest, and so you fill in the names of the groups of your stakeholders or the individuals in each of the quadrants to help you determine which how you might end up engaging with them.
So, I encourage everyone to take a look at our show notes because we have an example stakeholder analysis quadrant. And what I'm looking at here is on our y axis, so our north south axis, we start with low and we go up to high influence. And then on our x axis, we start on the left and go to our right and we go low to high interest. And what you're doing is you're plotting your stakeholders somewhere on this axis, and then where they sit is telling you how you're supposed to interact and manage this stakeholder. So some stakeholders we're going to be trying to keep them satisfied, where others we're going to manage more closely. Some stakeholders we just need to monitor, and some we just have to keep informed. So I encourage everyone to check out our show notes to see this example quadrant, and we've plotted a couple example stakeholders onto our chart. Now, if folks find this quadrant style maybe a little intimidating, or maybe the project they're doing is a little smaller and they're looking for a simpler way to analyze their stakeholders, is there another tool that you can suggest?
I also like particularly if it's, it's the first time somebody is doing this. I like something a little bit simpler, which has also four assessment criteria. The first one is to define the stakeholder importance to the organization. The second is to identify their interest in the organization, to assess their level of commitment, and to determine the intensity of the engagement strategy. And then I just rank them high, medium, and low. And that kind of helps you. I find it's a little bit easier, particularly for those who are new to stakeholder assessment, or even the concept of stakeholders.
Thanks, Chris. Both of these tools are great. And once this analysis is done, I like to keep this information on a table format where I can list the stakeholders, and in the different columns, I can record their level of interest versus our desired level of interest from them, their influence, communication preferences, and other things that we need to know about the stakeholder or what our stakeholder wants from us. We have a simple example in our show notes again at rotarypm.ca. Once the analysis is done, the work is not done, however. This is not a set and forget concept with stakeholders and stakeholder analysis. I think project teams should be coming back to review this and updating this information on a regular basis and keeping everyone updated. But who on a project should be managing stakeholders?
Everybody on the project, at least the core project team members, those who are responsible for, so you have an overall project manager, and then you've got those who are the leads, or the sub project managers, the team managers. Everybody has a responsibility for stakeholder management to some extent, because different teams on a project have some aspect of that stakeholder engagement that they're going to be responsible for. Within the overall defined stakeholder list, they may have responsibility for a subsection of that list. It's important for them to understand who their direct or their most important stakeholders are within the team concept, so that they can make sure that whatever engagement or communication that needs to occur with those stakeholders actually occurs, whether they do it themselves or through a communication manager or whoever it might be.
So what could happen if on a project we don't properly identify or correctly analyze our stakeholders?
Well, the risk is that you miss someone altogether. I mean, that's probably the highest risk. Or that you're miscommunicating, misunderstanding with what kind of frequency you should be communicating. Either you're communicating too often or too little. And it's not just communication, it's also other engagement.
Yeah, I've worked on projects where we've missed a stakeholder altogether, and only to discover that if we had engaged with them, we would have saved ourselves a ton of work. I can think of examples where we worked hard on a new process only to discover it's not compatible with a critical stakeholder.
Well, so if we just think about for a moment members and the frequency with which we want to communicate and engage our members, there's a need to ensure that your members are aware of what's going on, if not every step of the way, but with some regularity, so there aren't any surprises. The last thing you want is people to be surprised. At least negatively surprised, like how did that happen, or how come I didn't know about that, or well, why didn't you ask me? Those kinds of things. So that's why it's important, and those can be very high risk situations. Well, if you'd asked me last week, I was available, but this week I'm not. Those kinds of things. And from the perspective of members, the engagement of members in these projects, it's important from an overall member engagement perspective, because without engaged members, it reduces our impact, it reduces what we can do. So it's important that we understand what our members want to know, when they want to know it, how they want to know it. We probably don't do as good a job on some of these things as we ought to.
Chris, thank you so much for giving us a really good introduction to stakeholders and stakeholder analysis.
Thank you. I am delighted to share the knowledge around that. It's an important part of a project and not always done very well. It's all about, at the end of the day, it's all about people. And if we don't have the right tools, if we don't manage the people part of a project, then our project, I'm afraid, may be doomed to failure. So really paying attention to who those people are and what they're interested in is really important.
That's it for this episode. Thanks to Chris for speaking with us today. You can learn more about Chris and her business and links to other helpful resources in our show notes by visiting rotarypm.ca. If you have a PMI certification, did you know that you have just earned some PDUs for listening to this podcast? Visit rotarypm.ca and click on Claim PDUs. Thank you to you, our listeners, for supporting the podcast and Rotary. If you found this podcast helpful, please subscribe, share, and give us a review. We want to know how we're doing and ideas for future episodes. Check out the show notes or visit rotarypm.ca for all the details. And remember, Rotary is looking for change makers like you. There are Rotary and Rotaract clubs all around the world in most major communities. Visit rotary.org and click on the Club Finder link to see the clubs in your area. My name is Thomas Paul, and from everyone at the Rotary Club of Halifax Harbour, Rotary around the world.